Good evening, everyone, and hello from Wayne Law. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. As everyone is entering into our virtual space, your mics will be muted. You are welcome to keep your camera on or off. At the end of the presentation, I'll change the sort of view so that if folks want to be able to ask a question of Alan and be able to make virtual eye contact, we'll make sure that that's available for you. Tonight's presentation is also being recorded, so you should have maybe seen something pop up on your screen or see it in the upper corner. So just know that if you have to step away or the dog starts barking or whatever that may be, you can go back and watch. So now I'm going to kick it to my colleague, Rob McGregor, who will introduce Professor Alan Schenk, and then we'll get started. Rob?
Well, thank you, Wendy. Thank you for putting all this together, and welcome to all of you. This is a great turnout, and I know everyone is here to hear Alan, who is so beloved. This is one of our legal briefs sessions, and legal briefs are an opportunity for us to showcase the work and research of our Wayne Law faculty. So tonight we'll be hearing from Alan Schenk, the distinguished professor at Wayne State University Law School. I know that most of you know Alan better than I can do justice through an introduction, but for those who have not been fortunate enough to know Alan, I'll touch on a few high points. Alan earned his bachelor's in accounting and his law degree at the University of Illinois. He received his LLM in tax from New York University. He started at Wayne State and Wayne Law, actually, in 1966, and is teaching a full caseload now, 57 years later. So Alan has many teaching awards from both the law school, the university, and the state of Michigan. As I say, he is a beloved professor, and I just like to illustrate that fact with the fact that there are three former students. I know John Collins is on the call right now, John Grant and Joe Angelari, who decided to create an endowed chair in taxation named for Alan. And the chair currently has 1,426,500 committed of the 1.5 million. So anybody that wants to get in touch with me, be a part of that extra 73, give me a shout. But this is not a solicitation. We are here to learn about the law school. And so those of you who thought we were going to be hearing a value-added tax discussion from Alan are going to be disappointed to know that we're actually going to hear about the history of Wayne State and Wayne Law. Alan spent many years working on that, did a lot of terrific interviews, and quite a few of you on this call were interviewed and included in that book. So without further ado, thank you, Alan, for doing this for us.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Wendy. Nice to see so many of you. I can't see all of you on my screen, but I see Tracy and David and John and several others. By the way, some of you did not read the footnote in your degree that says you're not allowed to retire before your professors retire. So you might keep that in mind. So a number of years ago, my wife, Betty, asked me, are you the longest serving professor in the history of Wayne State Law School? And the answer was yes, but that and $5 will give me a cup of coffee at Starbucks. But other than that, so I've been here a long time. But I started thinking about my 57 years here. And I really started thinking that we don't really have a good idea of how we started, who we were, who we are, or who we might become. And so while I'm not a historian, and so it took me longer than usual to write this book, I asked some alums, and Eugene Dreiker, Nancy and Bill Edmonds, Judge Marilyn Kelly, and they all encouraged me to write the book, and the Dean's office encouraged me. And so I started this a number of years ago. And to start with, Wayne State's history is a history of a single lifetime. We're only 96 years old. But what I did find, and I think it's important, is that Wayne Law School provided access to a legal education to children of immigrants, blue-collar families, women, people from underrepresented groups. And in return, they actually pressed the law school for a better education, more job opportunities. Many times, especially in the long past, without the support or encouragement of the dean or the faculty. These students had grit, they were hungry, they wanted to succeed, and they learned a strong work ethic at home. Many may not have been able to get a legal education were it not for the fact that our tuition was low, that we had a night program for those that needed to work during the day, and we were located in Detroit to permit students that needed to work part-time while they went to law school. So how did Wayne State Law School get to where it is today? It wasn't a clear trajectory up. There were some bumps in the road. And so in the 1920s, when Detroit's population exploded, 60% increase in the population in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, the Detroit Board of Education, in addition to providing elementary and secondary education, were also providing college education through the colleges of the city of Detroit, as it was named. A teacher's college to provide teachers for their schools, a 2-year junior college that morphed into a 4-year liberal arts college, and several others. At the time, Alan Campbell, a respected lawyer in town, an adjunct professor at the Detroit College of Law, and also on the Detroit Board of Education, including as its chair, had a dream. And his dream was to have a better educated Michigan bar. He thought that the lawyers in Michigan did not have enough pre-law education, well-rounded education, to really serve the community, and thought that a public law school in Detroit could provide that bully pulpit to increase these requirements, these pre-law requirements. And so Alan Campbell and a few other adjuncts at the Detroit College of Law and a judge approached the Detroit Board of Education with a proposal to establish its own law school. As I say, Campbell was on the board, and he knew what kind of proposal might be acceptable to the board. And so their proposal was The board doesn't have to provide any money. That's all they ask the board to do, is to provide classrooms and administrative office and get the authority to issue diplomas so that their graduates could take the Michigan bar exam. Well, what happened? First of all, what happened was on July 1st, 1927, the school board established what was then called the Detroit City Law School. They appointed Alan Campbell as the first dean. Campbell, by the way, also continued to practice law in his law firm. And he had 2.5 months to organize a night-only law school, establish the admission and graduation requirements, prepare a curriculum, and attract faculty and students. Campbell hired a young lawyer in his office, Arthur Neef, who graduated from the University of Michigan Law School and had, quote unquote, a flair for administrative details. That'll come up later. And so in September of 1927, the Detroit City Law School opened, operating on the second floor of Old Main on Cass and Warren. Courses were taught almost exclusively by adjuncts, except for Campbell and Neef taught some. It had the lowest tuition in Michigan, $110 a semester, and the students paid the full freight. Their tuition paid for the entire operation of the law school. It attracted 213 students, 143 freshmen, and 70 transfer students, most of whom came from the Detroit College of Law. The law school from day one welcomed all students that met the pre-law education requirements. When many law schools at the time restricted or prohibited the admission of women, Jewish students, and people of color. So it's interesting that in that first year of 1927-28, the law school had 10% women in its student body. By 1930, it became 30%. To give a perspective, the University of Michigan Law School at the time had 3% women. Jewish students were welcomed. The colleges of the city of Detroit had a Jewish fraternity. That wasn't true of the other law schools. An African-American student was in the first graduating class in 1928. 10 years later, by 1937, the law school received preliminary provisional ABA accreditation. The colleges administered by the Board of Education were now called Wayne University, and the Detroit City Law School was renamed Wayne University Law School, 1937. In order to get full ABA accreditation, you had to have a day program. And so Arthur Neef became the second dean, 1937, added a day program, and in 1939, the law school received full ABA accreditation. Because the law school was funded on tuition during the Depression, when enrollment dropped, 1930s, and 1940s, when World War II took a lot of its male students, the law school almost closed. In 1945, at the close of the war, when Congress adopted the GI Bill, all of a sudden, Wayne University had a substantial increase in enrollment, and the Wayne University Law School did as well. Because of the added student body in the university as well as the law school, the president appointed Arthur Neef to serve as the provost of the university while continuing to serve as the law school dean, providing a built-in conflict of interest that actually resulted not in the law school getting more revenue than other units, but indeed getting almost the least per student allotment from the university of any college on campus. The graduates had very limited career opportunities. They were on their own. Some put up a shingle to practice by themselves or shared office space with other lawyers. Some went back to their hometown to practice. But even in that early post-World War II period, there were some stars. 1949, Bill Davidson graduated. He worked to help his family business that became Guardian Industries. Dorothy Comstock, who then became Dorothy Comstock Riley, was the first Hispanic the first Hispanic woman in the United States to be elected to a state's highest court. By 1954, there were a lot of full-time students around the law school, and they started realizing how much they weren't getting from their law school, in part because of the gap of having a part-time dean. They noticed that graduates couldn't get jobs with the corporate firms. They noticed that, unlike Michigan and the Eastern schools, Wayne did not have a law review for students to learn legal research and writing skills that were demanded by those corporate firms. And so in 1954, without faculty or decanal encouragement and a very skimpy budget and very little space to operate, the students started the Wayne Law Review to provide those essential credentials. And indeed, with that credential, 1955, a student by the name of Don Sheely was hired by the Dykema firm. Next year, editor-in-chief of the Law Review was hired by the Butzel firm, Hugo Edberg. 1960, African-American student Fernillis Armstrong served on the Law Review and later in her career became a U.S. magistrate. 1961, these are isolated cases. Don't get the impression that things were going well. 1961, Eugene Dreiker was the first Wayne graduate hired in the Justice Department's honors program. John Scott, hired by the Dickinson law firm. So the American Bar Association reaccredits law schools every 7 years. Our 7 years came up in 1959. And after looking at the program, the American Bar Association committee wrote a scathing letter on what they saw. School has a poor physical plant. It had been operating in a mansion on Cass that previously was a print shop. Inadequate funding for the program, poorly paid faculty. And they pointed out that during 1957 to 59, when Wayne transitioned from a school administered by the Board of Education to a state university with more resources, this was a golden opportunity for the school to get more revenue and make real progress. One positive development from that scathing report is that Arthur Neef and the president at the time went to the legislature and asked for funding to build a new law school. It did. It opened in 1966, and it was in 1966 dedicated by the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Earl Warren. In the early 1960s, at colleges around the country, a lot of activism. Vietnam War, civil rights. And a group of the students went down to Selma to join in the Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights. Actually, that march occurred it was canceled, and a couple of weeks later, the real march occurred. They didn't go down for that, but they were so taken with this fight for civil rights and a burning desire to provide legal services to people that couldn't afford to hire a lawyer to provide services. At the same time, 1965 is when the Michigan Supreme Court issued a court rule that allowed students with practicing lawyer supervision to represent clients in Michigan courts. And so without law school financial support or encouragement, the students established in 1965 the Free Legal Aid Clinic, becoming the first in the country to operate a tax-exempt, student-run clinic. Well, the faculty was not happy with Arthur Neef as dean, especially all those years that he co-served as provost of the university, and had petitioned the president of the university to find new leadership. Well, the president of the university knew Arthur Neef personally. He had him as his provost. And so nothing happened. Then Wayne State University hired its first outside president, William Ray Keast. And a couple of students met privately with President Keast and again petitioned him to provide new leadership at the law school. And President Keast established a committee to make a national search for new leadership. And in December of 1967, Charles Joyner became the third dean of the law school. Served until 1972, when he became federal judge in the district court in the Eastern District of Michigan. And in those 4+ years, radically changed the school and its reputation with the leaders in the legal community in Michigan and nationally. Joyner had served as associate dean at the University of Michigan Law School and knew how to run an elite law school, and made proposals to Keast and said, this is what I'd like to do, and I need the resources to do it. And Keast provided those resources. With Joyner's leadership, the faculty changed from a faculty of teachers who were also practitioners, because Arthur Neef encouraged his faculty to go downtown and practice law. don't worry about publishing, into a faculty of teacher scholars, many of whom engaged in law reform. So here we are at the end of 1967. Joyner inherited many talented students who wanted military deferments. 3-year reprieve sounded good. The University of Michigan Law School limited its acceptance of Michigan residents. And so a lot of very talented people came to Wayne Law School. At the same time, the corporate firms needed more new associates for their expanding practices. And we're not getting enough of them from Michigan and the Eastern elite schools that they always limited their associates to. And so that was, the stage was set. Joyner was known and respected in the Michigan legal community. In fact, he served as the as the head of the Michigan bar while he was still dean. And he was known nationally in the American Bar Association. He had been very active. And so here's Charlie Joyner. He was known to his faculty as Charlie. Promoted his students, promoted his faculty with the leaders in the legal community in Michigan and nationally. He hired one graduate to help him during that year. That graduate, by the way, Ty Fainer, became Illinois Attorney General, managing partner of Mayor Brown in Chicago. So starting with Joyner, Wayne graduates had some opportunities that previously were limited to graduates from Michigan and elite law schools, and they excelled at these Michigan law firms. For the first time in more than token numbers, corporate firms started hiring Wayne lawmen as associates. I see David Joswick. He was one of them. He became a partner at Miller Canfield in record time, and his firm hired many more Wayne graduates. Jim Robinson became the head of litigation at the Honeyman firm before he became U.S. Attorney, the 8th Dean of the law school, and the head of the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And the list goes on. Richard Burstein, noted local practitioner at the Honeyman firm. Robert Carson established his own firm. Well, before 1971, no female graduate of Wayne State Law School was hired by one of the corporate firms. Even women that served, that were first in their classes. First in the class 1963, first in the class 1964. The firms wouldn't even talk to them. It took a few years, but starting in 1971, women law students on graduation started obtaining these most sought after jobs. Helen Petroskas, hired by the Ford Motor Company legal department, and became Ford's first female vice president. Marilyn Kelly became Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, serving on the Wayne State Board of Governors. And when she retired from the court, she was appointed as the law school distinguished jurist in residence. Julia Darlow. This is all 1971. Julia Darlow, hired by the Dickinson firm, became the first female president of the Michigan Bar. A couple others followed. Today, those firms are heavily weighted with Wayne law graduates. I can see one that was a few years later, David Hempstead, sitting out in the audience today. I hope you don't mind me telling this story, David, but David and a classmate, after the first year, Michigan historically has offered the opportunity to transfer to the University of Michigan from Wayne, students that did well. And Wayne and his friend, David and his friend did well. And they both had the opportunity to transfer to Michigan. David stayed at Wayne, his friend went to Michigan. They both ended up at the same law firm. But guess who led the high income practice at the Bodman firm? It was our graduate, David Hempstead. Joyner believed that the law schools had a duty to create a more racially diverse student body and a more racially diverse legal profession. Wayne already had many graduates of color who rose in the legal profession. Lots of judges: Geraldine Bledsoe Ford, Claudia Markham, Warfield Moore. Wayne Budd, graduate in 1967. Wayne became the first and only African-American U.S. attorney in Massachusetts. Elliott Hall, again, worked for Ford Motor Company, for one of the big corporate firms. Before the 1970s, African Americans in the criminal justice system would not hire African American lawyers to defend them. That changed with two of our graduates, Cornelius Pitts and Kenny Cockrell. Well, during the late 1960s, there were a lot of protests here and at the elite schools in the East to increase the number of people of color that were admitted to law school. 1968, Congress appropriated funds to increase the racial diversity of the legal profession. Legal profession was way behind other professions in diversification. The Council on Legal Education Opportunity was created, CLEO. And the idea behind CLEO was that they offered summer programs at several locations around the country. The idea was to provide a summer program for people of color who were not already admitted to law schools. And if they succeeded in the legal courses that they took over the summer, the participating law schools agreed to accept some of them. Wayne was one of the co-sponsors. Charlie Joyner was a strong supporter. And Wayne took about 17 students from that program. At a time when the law school didn't really provide much academic support, no special academic support for first-year students, whoever they were. And so they were admitted. And during that year, they and their supportive classmates petitioned the school, change your outmoded policies. Strong advocates Uh,
I can't do it.
Judge
Uh,
Ray Grimes,
Hold on.
who graduated in 1970. He was not part of that group, but no doubt was one of the supporters of. And again, it was the students that got the faculty to change. And so the law school provided academic support for first-year students, transitioned to law school, established anonymous grading. It used to be that the first year, you only took one exam at the end of the year in each of your first-year classes. And that one exam gave you your entire grade in the course. They got the faculty to change, to split it into 2 courses so that at least you had an exam at the end of the fall term so students could tell how they were doing. Were they doing well? Were they not doing well? Well, most of them from the Clio program succeeded. Our judges and practitioners today doing quite well. Or some of them are even retired. Later 1970s, Don Gordon was dean. We increased the international opportunities for students to take courses abroad, faculty to teach abroad, foreign students and professors to come to Wayne. In 1978, the Supreme Court decided the Bakke case, imposing some restrictions on affirmative action. That prompted the faculty to look at and revise its admission standards so that it complied with the Bakke requirements. It did that in a faculty meeting closed to the public. And so what happened? Our students did what they were taught to do by their professors, and they sued the law school for violating the Michigan Open Meetings Act. And they won. And the faculty had to redo it. Things changed in 1982 with the 82 recession that had a long-term effect, not only on the law school, on higher education. Law school applications, most of you don't remember the 82 recession, but it was tough for Michigan. The auto industry was really hit. So applications declined. The faculty decided that rather than reducing admission standards in order to maintain the size of the student body, cut the student body to maintain the standards. Tuition went down. University had problems, got lower allocation from the state legislature. And so tuition went up. And that has continued since 1982. So when you look at what's happened with tuition in higher education today, not only in Michigan or across the country, it goes back to legislatures cutting appropriations and the universities increasing tuition in order to fill that gap in the budget. We've talked a lot about the law school providing associates to the corporate law firms. Wayne became a feeder to the tax department of the international accounting firms as well. Small number of male graduates in the 1970s that increased as the years went on by, with more and more hiring of women rising to prominent positions in the fields in their firms. The early ones were Denton Wolf, John Grant, Kathleen Williams Newell, and then Don Wilson, Joe Angelari, Lynn Gandhi, Margaret Schulman, Aziza Pratt Yudasheva, and the list goes on. Wayne Law was thriving. It was viewed by most applicants as the second best law school in Michigan after the University of Michigan. 1995, Wayne Law graduates had opportunities to secure many of the most coveted legal positions in Michigan. Alumni became managing partners in those firms. 3 successive managing partners at Warner, Norcross, and Judd were Wayne graduates. Many became general counsel for the large Michigan and other corporations. John Collins at Champion Homes, Terry Larkin at Lear Corporation, Alex Majowick at Cooper Standard, Jay Colvin, Detroit Lions, after he had a long history at the Bodman firm. Jason Hillman, after 5 years of practice, became the general counsel of Cleveland Cavaliers, and the list goes on. These, I just picked out a few names. Alumni became law school professors, law school deans. 2 of our graduates became our dean, Jim Robinson, Joan Mahoney. Larry Mann went from teaching at Wayne to practicing, coming back and teaching, going back to practice. Bill Volz became the dean at our business school. But in 1995, Detroit College of Law affiliated with Michigan State to create a second Big Ten law school in Michigan. And so the law school decided to take action to maintain its competitive position. Many students that have been admitted to both law schools still choose Wayne. But the law school added a new building with an impressive facade, offered more and larger scholarships to compete with DCL MSU. Dean Ackerman publicized the law school as a center for excellence in public interest and social justice. Jocelyn Benson, now the Secretary of State, focused on fundraising, publicized our mission, got 2 of the largest gifts in law school history, $5 million each from Dan Gilbert and Steve Ross. And we were already getting funding. The Cohn family provided funding for a trial advocacy lectures series. Detroit Law School, Detroit location has become an important asset, offering richer clinical legal education programs and experiential learning. In 1998, the presidents of Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb bars were all Wayne women. Students continue to excel. We've had for decades outstanding program in national and international moot court competitions. And in 2018, the Jessup team was in the top 16 in the world in that very impressive Jessup competition. The school established the Keith Center for Civil Rights, building on the school's long focus on civil rights, starting with the first graduate in 1928, Ernie Goodman, who became a national civil rights figure, Dean Robb, Bruce Miller, Paula Edelbrig on gay rights, Michael Pitt, Dana Nessel, our Michigan Attorney General. When Senator Levin retired from the Senate, he joined the law school, and the school established the Levin Center to recognize his pet project in the Senate of honest and open government oversight. And our students have the opportunity for DC internships. Well, a key component of Wayne's improvement over decades is the alumni involvement, decades-long involvement in the law school. Too many to name, but some who were committed for decades included Eugene Dreiker, Judge Nancy Edmonds, Tom Kienbaum, Bill Winston, Kathy Humphrey. A little bit about our deans. When I started doing the work on this history, what I discovered, unlike a lot of histories of law schools, I read a lot of histories of law schools. It's all during the deanship of John Doe. This is what we built. This is what we did. But what's been unique about Wayne are the students. But there have been a few deans that have been exceptional, I found. The first dean, Alan Campbell, was responsible for the establishment of the law school, pretty significant. Charles Joyner, I've already mentioned, from 67 to 72. Transformative dean who had a vision and goals for the law school that were achieved in his short tenure. In a history, it usually is difficult to put in perspective the impact of people and events as they are occurring. But Dean Richard Biersbach has been our second transformative dean. So what's so special about Rick Biersbach? Well, first of all, Rick came with extraordinary credentials. First in his class in law school, U.S. Supreme Court clerk, worked for Wall Street law firms, had a high position in the U.S. Justice Department, and then an academic and administrative record at Yeshiva Law School. The dean serves two masters. A dean serves at the pleasure of the president of the university, and the faculty expects the dean to promote the interests of the law school and its faculty. So there are tensions. And Rick established a mutually beneficial partnership between the law school and the university. When he came, he first had to eliminate the budget deficit that he inherited. And then he and Rob McGregor's development staff worked to raise outside funds to supplement the law school budget. With the cooperation of the faculty, he worked to establish a minor in law in liberal arts, and just this past week, a major in law in liberal arts college, in order to increase the attractiveness of Wayne's undergraduate program. And some of our colleagues teach in that program. Rick got the faculty engaged in improving the school, a feat that many other deans could never succeed at. And during his initial appointment as dean, he was recently reappointed for another 5 years. The law school's U.S. News ranking, which was 100 out of 200 law schools when he took over, to currently 58th in the country. Well, I can't end without at least talking a little bit about our faculty, especially the adored teachers. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the students singled out a few faculty for special merit. By the way, I must say, Wayne Law School has an exceptionally large number of excellent teachers. That's not true at law schools across the country. Historically, it was not true, for example, at Harvard, notorious for terrible teachers. Anyway, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Don Gordon, a shining star at the time, especially in the 50s and 60s, who invited students and some faculty to his home to discuss legal issues on Friday nights. Boaz Siegel, a graduate of the law school, started teaching soon after graduation, developed a labor law practice, was adored by students. Tom Cowan, a scholar and a demanding teacher when there were few scholars on the faculty. He left after about 7 years to go to Rutgers. In the decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, students regularly honored 3 faculty. Janet Finlater was selected as the best teacher in 18 of her 40 years on the faculty, more than anyone in the school's history. Steve Schulman, idiosyncratic Steve Schulman. Many of you certainly remember him. Cigarette smoking, pacing up and down. Stephen Schulman, beloved by students, liaison to the law review for decades. And Joe Grano, the quote unquote conservative on the faculty, who was adored by liberal and conservative students. He was a terrific teacher. And in the 21st century, students have singled out several teachers for special recognition, including Noah Hall, Chris Lund, Eric Zaks, Will Ortman. I've taught at 10 different schools, and I feel fortunate to have been associated with a school with extraordinary students who have become leaders in the legal profession. And I mean this with all seriousness. Wayne State Law School is the best place to teach, and it's because of the students. Thanks very much. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Ellen. That was terrific. Really wonderful. Yeah. Are there questions for Alan? Just general discussion that anyone would like to have?
Hi, Rob. It's Kelly Carter here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, beautiful, Kelly.
And forgive me because I have to hop off soon. I'm in my Uber here in Chicago. I don't
Hi,
have a
Kelly.
question. Hi, Alan. I am rather emotional and I'm trying not to cry because I just have so much gratitude for you, for what you've shared, the book. I'm overcome by immense pride right now. And I'm just very thankful that you've shared this history with us. And it just causes me to take a moment to think through my own journey, right? My own experiences at Wayne and all of the ways that my education and time there set me up for complete success as an attorney. So I just want to say nothing but thank you. I support you, I adore you. And so this was gold. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I will say that Kelly and I were chatting in the chat, and Kelly also commented that she is still teaching. She's teaching a couple of classes now in Chicago, and certainly credits Alan for getting her into teaching. She was teaching at Wayne Law for a little while remotely. So we appreciate.
She taught accounting for lawyers.
Yes.
Tracy, did I see your hand up a second ago? Oh, you're muted. Oh, there you are.
I put something in the chat, but for those of us that were around with Steve Schulman and Professor Schenk, I don't know, Professor Schenk, if you remember that in business planning, the year-long course, it was a take-home exam in December and a take-home exam in May. And the year that I was graduating in 79, I graduated in 80, rumor went out to you and Professor Schulman that students were going to work together on the exam. And so we were forced to come to school and take a 2-day in-class exam in December and a 2-day in-class exam in May.
I remember.
And I went up to you in December and I said, first of all, this is worse than the bar exam. The bar exam is only 2 days. And second of all, what on earth would make you think that people weren't working together on take-home exams? And you said to me, Professor Schenk, well, doesn't that make you angry because they'll be able to come up with a better result and a better outcome, and it will change the curve? And I was such a smart ass. I said, no, because I'm going to get it right anyway. Thank you. Thank you for this. And thank you all. This was really a wonderful hour. I'm so glad we got to have this time together.
I seem to remember in 1982, it was just a single take-home exam. That's when you were in Washington, Ellen, and it was John and Steve doing the class. And so they didn't do a December one. It was just a one at the end of the year. But there was a promise from everyone that they would be their own work. And as far as I know, everybody in our class honored that promise.
Thanks, Michael. I remember you were a neighbor of mine right across the street in Detroit.
Yep, best neighborhood I ever lived in.
I can talk.
Yep, go for it, David. You're up.
I talk too much every stroke, but thank you, thank you, thank you. Very good.
You know, there's a story about David Hempstead. So Steve Schulman and I taught the business planning course together. And we gave the exam in the fall. And there's a student that got the top score on the corporate securities part of the exam. And Steve Schulman said to me, you know, I have to call this guy in because I don't know who he is. He never says anything in class. That student was David Hempstead. Long time ago, my goodness, David.
Thank you.
45 years ago, 48 years ago. Barry Powers, I see you're on them.
Hey, David. John Collins, way back from a long time ago playing football at Victory Gardens when we were in middle school. So
That's
thank you
right.
for being here tonight. And thanks for all the things you've done for the law school and support over the years. And you're obviously.
I remember you. Yep.
Hey, John. Thank you.
Professor Schenk, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
I just heard this morning on the radio, Mark Twain said that he wasn't sure whether history repeated itself or not, but sometimes it rhymes. Having engaged in this enterprise of becoming a historian, thank you so much for the superlative survey of Wayne Law School back to its inception. But I'm wondering, where do you see Wayne Law School going in the next short-term future, next 3-4 years, or perhaps even, into the next few decades? Where do you see it going in the future?
If we continue to attract deans like Rick Biersbach and the university continues to support the law school, and Rob McGregor does a good job in getting the extra funds to supplement the law school budget, I see nothing but up. Because we're doing on any kind of objective scale, we are doing better. We have always done better than our numbers indicated. We finally have the numbers coming up closer because people don't know where Wayne State University is, because they ask lawyers and judges from all over the country. We don't know any state called Wayne State.
Alan, I just want to say thank you as somebody who was fortunate enough to be your student and then come back and work for over a decade with you in the law school, and to witness being on the other side of the curtain and witness what you were doing to
Thank you,
contribute to the
Mr.
school all
Rose.
these years.
Here's a case, brother and sister, both graduates of law school. Asa was a graduate a little later in time.
Yeah,
Alan,
most people thought
maybe,
Isa was my daughter, not my sister, but she was the one I became Isa's brother.
Alan, if I could say a couple things here. Your career and my career, we started pretty much the same time at Wayne. And I think that was one of the great strengths, has been one of the great strengths of the law school, is that those years, 1966, those early years, I was there 66 to 69. The faculty was more like colleagues at that point in time. And that was a wonderful training ground. Spending time in Steve Schulman's apartment while he was drinking martinis and eating geosil as a counter to the gin, and smoking endless cigarettes. But it was a wonderful learning experience. And it was, I think, that faculty that really helped to shape the students, and they really came out of the box during that era. From the time you started until the next 20 years, Wayne was the place that was generating really great practitioners. And I know that because I ran the recruiting business or as part of the recruiting committee at Miller Canfield for many years. And I hired lots of Wayne graduates. And the qualities that they brought were they came ready to practice. They came ready to work. Where so many, I don't want to be pejorative about other law schools, but that maybe they were turning out people to save the world or run the world, et cetera. Wayne was turning out people who were going to be practitioners and wanted to be practitioners. And so that was very valuable. And I think that was highlighted by the fact that since that time, I've taught at Wayne, I've taught at Detroit Mercy, I've taught at University of Michigan on a couple of occasions, et cetera. And it's the student body at Wayne has always been the best that from a teacher's standpoint. So thank you very much, because you're very much a part of all that.
Thanks, David. I remember a story that you told me, David, that I think is emblematic of our students. You told me that that over the summer you got a position with your firm, with Miller Canfield, as a summer intern before they hired you. And that almost every day, a couple of new associates from some Eastern schools used to come into your office and ask you questions. You always thought that they were trying to determine whether or not you knew anything. And you soon discovered that they were coming into your office because they didn't know what you knew, and they were using you as the resource for their legal education.
That's absolutely right. And between the two of them, they were younger associates, and they were both Phi Beta Kappas from Eastern universities. One was from Yale Law School, and the other one was from Harvard. So, but the reality was they didn't know diddly about actually practicing law or learning any of the stuff that or applying what it is that they were supposed to have learned in law school. So at one point, I know Miller Canfield, I was told, had the highest number, the greatest number of Wayne graduates of any organization in the whole country. So, and I don't know if that's still true today, since I'm old and retired, et cetera, but it was in my day. So, and John Collins, who's on here tonight, was actually part of that as well.
Yeah, you're right, David, I was, and I just, again, echo all the things you've said. And one of the greatest, one of my proudest moments when Alan, when you were, I think as Mike mentioned earlier, when you were on a sabbatical, I asked me to step in and teach business planning with Steve. I'll never forget that. That was an amazing event, fantastic class. And as others said, you know, we went at Mr. Mike's after class and a few martinis and the constant cigarette smoking, but an amazing source of insight and thoughtfulness and creativity. What a great experience. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And while writing a history is not my forte, and it took me a long time, I really enjoyed the opportunity to dig in and find out more about our students, our graduates that I never knew. I never knew about the law school. I remember when I started, like you just said, David. So I said to the dean, to Arthur Neef at the time, I want to teach tax. Anything else that you want me to teach, that's okay. And so he said, well, okay, since you are teaching one code, the Internal Revenue Code, why don't you teach the Uniform Commercial Code? And back in those days, first of all, it was relatively new. The UCC was just being adopted in the States. And so I said, Dean, I only had one course in the UCC in law school. I had it from a person that drafted the UCC, but I only had one course. No, that's okay. That's okay. And so in those years, that first year, 66 to 67, students thought I was better in the UCC than in the tax course because I was 1 week ahead of them in the UCC. I knew the problems that they were facing because I was facing the same problems. And so thankfully, we hired other people to teach the UCC. But yes, we were colleagues, and I've been around a long time. I was talking to my son, and I said to him a couple of years ago, I said, you know, the university has this early retirement system. He says, Dad, that train left a long time ago. Too late for you to take early retirement. But it's been a joy. It's been a joy because of people like you, because of the alumni of this law school.
Hey, Alan, I don't know if they told you, but since you didn't take early retirement, you can never retire.
The next 57 years are going to be great.
Thank you. Well, if that's it,
Yeah.
thanks all for joining us.
Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Bye.
Thank you all.